Great, thank you. Welcome to the Bioregional Regeneration Summit, and in particular to this session on bioregional donuts, regenerating bioregional carrying capacity with the new United Nations indicators and more, I should say. My name is Bill Baue. I'm with R3.0, Redesign for Resilience and Regeneration, and I'm joined by Isabel Carlisle from the Bioregional Learning Center and Randy Saad of Refocus and the Flourishing Enterprise Institute. And we're going to speak with you, both give it some short presentations, but also importantly and excitingly share conversation with you for the next 90 minutes or 85, shall we call it. Isabel, Randy, and I have very short presentations just to get some information out on the table for discussion. Our goal is to make those presentations relatively brief and then to really move into question and answer session after that. In particular, we didn't make these very detail heavy, so there are many more details that we could discuss, but we decided that it made most sense to be responsive to questions that come in rather than trying to cover everything to begin with. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give a presentation, then Isabel, and then Randy. I am going to be giving some background on the donut and carrying capacity thresholds that would also apply to Isabel and Randy's presentations. So I want to take you all the way back about 50 years to the Limits to Growth report. Oh, sorry about that red circle there. That wasn't meant to be there. But this is the report that came out in 1972 that really brought to the forefront the idea of carrying capacity thresholds. And it introduced the idea of overshoot and collapse, where, if you are within your carrying capacity, as we see up at the top here in the middle, if your population is rising and you have a carrying capacity of, say, the food that's available to feed that population or the resources, you're within carrying capacity, you're golden, you're sustainable, you're regenerating that food at a rate that's sufficient to feed the population. The problem is when you go beyond carrying capacity, when the population exceeds its carrying capacity, you experience what they called overshoot and collapse. You're overshooting your carrying capacity. You're overshooting the capacity of the resources to feed or to provide for the population. And I include the graph on the right. I don't expect you to really understand that one, except for that this is really sort of the iconic graph that shows sort of what the limits to growth projected would happen. Didn't predict, but projected as a possibility. And Gaia Harrington has just recently done a redo of that research using the World 3, the original model that the limits to growth folks used. And she found that we're essentially replicating that and are right where all of those lines meet is where we're at right about now. So this is the idea of carrying capacity thresholds. Added to that 2 years later was the idea of not only outer limits, so ecological thresholds that are outer limits, but also inner limits. So it basically said that we have these carrying capacities, not just of ecological resources, but we have minimum foundations, you might call them, of resources for fulfilling human needs. And that we have to really manage for both of those. So that was in 1974. Let's fast forward now to 2009, when the Stockholm Resilience Center established the idea of planetary boundaries. So they took that idea of carrying capacity and limits to growth and applied it to 9 different Earth systems that you see in the wedges here on the left. This is actually not the original version. The original version from 2009 showed that we were overshooting on only 3 of these 9 Earth systems. This is the most recent research that shows that actually now we are overshooting on 6 of those 9 Earth systems. And in fact, 2 more of those planetary boundaries actually we're in overshoot as well. The research is just still in the peer review process. That's information thanks to Joe Brewer. Then if we fast forward to 2012, this is where the title for this session comes in, is that Kate Rayworth established the Doughnut, where she took these planetary boundaries that you see on the outer ring, the ecological ceilings, if you will, and she added the social foundations. So she essentially did what the UNEP Kokoyuk Declaration called for in 1974. And as you'll see, we are transgressing at this point all of the social foundations and 8 of the 9 ecological ceilings. So that's 20 of 21 we are either overshooting or undershooting, according to the research. Just to give you one other example of a carrying capacity threshold, when COVID hit, this diagram went viral, if you will. And what it shows is it took long-standing graphics from the Center for Disease Control in the US that had these 2 curves. One curve is if you don't take preventive protective measures to a pandemic, whether it's COVID or any pandemic, and if you do take protective measures. The researcher who created this graphic, and the reason it went viral is he added this dotted line of the healthcare system capacity. That's a carrying capacity. That's a threshold. That's a donut threshold, if you will. So the healthcare system capacity is the number of beds, the number of respirators, the number of doctors who have knowledge, the number of nurses who have human capital knowledge, the number of emergency room teams that are a network, that's social capital, if you will. And we just can't exceed that carrying capacity of the healthcare system if we want to navigate a pandemic successfully. So that's just a hands-on example. I want to now shift into translating these donut thresholds into implementation. And I'm going to lay on you some fairly, could be complicated notions. I'm going to try and do it fairly simply. The underlying idea is around stocks and flows of resources, if you will, and or capital resources. Some people use that language. And the whole idea is that in order to sustain ourselves, in order to be viable, we need to take the stocks of a resource, the amount of a resource that's available, and draw from the flows, the regeneration of that resource on a regular basis, on a continual basis. So I included this slide because I really wanted to upend the notion that regeneration and sustainability are 2 separate things, or that regeneration is better than sustainability. No, regeneration and sustainability are absolutely intertwined. In order to be sustainable, you must have constant regeneration of a resource if you want to be using that resource on a regular basis. We can come back to this slide, but I just wanted to establish that. The other thing that is really key, if you're wanting to measure these carrying capacity thresholds, you need a conceptual framework. You need an idea of how you're going to do that. And this was delivered to us by Mark McElroy, who actually worked directly with the lead author of The Limits to Growth, Dana Meadows. He was chair of her Sustainability Institute until she died in 2001. And those conversations that they had really resulted in him essentially conceiving, how can you apply these carrying capacity thresholds at an organizational level, for example. And so he said is, simplistically, you need to take an actual impact. What's the actual impact in the world that's happening, and compare that to a normative impact, or what would the impact need to be in order to respect the carrying capacity of that threshold. So just to give you a quick example of that, let's take carbon. That's one that people often find understandable. A carbon footprint is just an individual organization's carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. That's the actual impact. The norm here, or what we would need to do in order to be sustainable, is we would have to respect the overall carbon budget. So that carbon footprint must be a proportionate, fair share of respecting the carbon budget. Another example is living wage. This is often used, and apologies if folks have seen this example before, but I wanted to use an ecological and social example. In this example, the actual pay on the left is £8.25, but that is below what a family would actually need as a wage in order to live just at a basic subsistence level. So as you can see here, the norm would be the living wage, and you would want to be on the right side of that if you want to be sustainable. The last example I'll give is just water, another one that we use regularly. And I think this is helpful because whereas carbon is a global impact, water is an inherently localized or bioregional impact. You're looking at the watershed level. So the availability of renewable water supplies on a watershed basis is what you need to look at. So what's happening in the watershed to your left or your right or above you or below you is really irrelevant, if you will. It's really what's happening within your watershed. And there's a threshold of the available water that's regenerated on an annual basis. And then there's allocations of that at an organizational level. So the use by all of the organizations, and including nature's uses and just human use of it, can't exceed the amount that's available. And of course, we know that this has happened or almost happened in Johannesburg on day zero, that they just narrowly averted that crisis a few years ago. So now let's shift to the actual example of the United Nations. In particular, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development that we've been working with for a number of years, 4 years now. And this week saw the release of that, the fruits of that labor in the Sustainable Development Performance Indicators. Just as background, we actually have indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. Those have existed since 2015. There are 246 of these indicators, but only a handful actually have thresholds in them. So arguably, the Sustainable Development Goal indicators don't tell us anything about sustainability. As you can see here, they have a poverty line and freshwater withdrawal compared to freshwater resources. Those are the only two thresholds in the SDG indicators. That's the reason why UNRISD pursued this development of a new set of indicators. This is the report that just came out this week, the Authentic Sustainability Assessment. That's a user's manual for a number of sustainable development performance indicators that we developed with UNRISD over the past 4 years. Ralph and I, who are on, Ralph's on the call, managed the piloting of this with the organizations that you see on the right. So that included not just large for-profit enterprises such as Manulife, the big asset manager, or Anglo-American, even the mining company, but also smaller social and solidarity economy enterprises like two different Mondragon cooperatives, Cabot Creamery Cooperative in the US here, Van City, the financial co-op in Canada, a number of co-ops in India, for example, the GVK Society, et cetera. These are the different organizations that piloted, as well as some additional organizations that weren't companies. They were mostly companies. And so, these indicators would need to be translated into applicability, for example, at the bioregional level. But it was piloted by, for example, the World Bank, and even a municipality took place that you'll hear about a little bit later. So I just want to give 3 examples. I'm not going to go into too much depth here on the indicators themselves. We can go into more depth later. But I'm really just wanting to present the idea of applying this approach in this particular instance of the UN, and how this could be translated to apply at the bioregional level. So I'll just give the example of, again, greenhouse gas emissions. In each of the instances, there's either a threshold, so a sustainability threshold approach, or a transformation approach. So in this instance, it set a threshold that the GHG emissions by an organization shall be no more than 0. In this instance, it's basically said, in order to be sustainable, you have to not emit carbon at all. But it recognized that barely any organization is there. And so you have to have a pathway, a set of interim targets that one would meet in order to comply with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change pathways or trajectories of decarbonization. So this is all of the wonky stuff on the right. If you want to dig into that, it's there. The significant thing here is that this provides an alternative to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is right now the gold standard for this kind of assessment, that has some governance challenges and doesn't allow for the use of the most ambitious goal-setting method right now. I can talk more about that one later. Sticking with the examples that we had earlier, there's also in the socioeconomic indicators, there's a living wage indicator that does exactly what was demonstrated before. It essentially compares what the actual wages are to the norm, the living wage. Finally, I just wanted to give one example of a transformation indicator. And so this is an indicator that looks at resilience. And it essentially says, what is the entity's own assessment of its capacity to learn, innovate, and adapt in the face of disruptive change? And so it gives essentially a chart on how to self-assess around resilience, recognizing that in essence, most indicators right now do not give us this ability to assess that. And so the way that UNRISD applied the idea of transformation is, what's the status quo practice and what would be a necessary practice to adopt to transform from the status quo to something that's sufficient to get us to a regenerative and sustainable and even potentially a thrivable a world, or a thrivable bioregion in this instance. I'm going to end it off there and hand it over to Isabel. Isabel has been doing work directly at the bioregional level, implementing Doughnuts, the Doughnut. So Isabel, over to you. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much. That was completely fascinating and relates very much to what we're doing. So I'm going to go into a slide deck and talk through how we came to make the Doughnut for Devon and how we came to settle on particular scenarios and indicators, and haven't quite yet worked out thresholds, but how we're going to use it as well. But I just wanted to kind of loop back to what Bill was saying, particularly about water, and that slide about the quotient threshold related to water. That's incredibly relevant here, and to know that there's an ecological boundary. So this summer, our rivers in Devon became incredibly low. It was frightening to see how low they got, because a lot of our drinking water comes out of our rivers. So seeing them that low means we know that water is being pumped across the county from a very big river called the Tamar, and being treated twice so it can turn into drinking water. But we want to do work in the near future on the carrying capacity of our river, not just the carrying capacity in terms of how much drinking water it can supply, but also its capacity to absorb sewage, which is discharged into the river, and its capacity to support the ecological life of the river. So this is all very, very relevant to the work that we're doing here. So let me get into the slideshow. I'll make that full screen. So I am going to take you through a slide deck that I created for some teaching I did recently at Schumacher College, which is just nearby. And I was asked to kind of think about how to put the Doughnut and bioregional thinking together. So I'll reprise that in this slideshow, but I also wanted you to understand the ground from which the Devon Doughnut arose. So first of all, let me just make sure I can navigate here. So this is our definition of a bioregion, which in fact, let me get it back again, which I'm going to try and move this. Yes, that's good. Okay. So you can all read that, I think. I think it's quite large and quite clear. It's also the definition we've been using for Regenerative Communities Network. And what's crucial, I think, about this definition, perhaps in comparison to other definitions of bioregions, is we're very explicitly saying that bioregioning is a relational practice. And one of the beautiful things about creating the Devon Doughnut is that it got us into relationships that we would never have been able to get into. So I'm really advocating the use of a kind of a multi-stakeholder process to animate your place. So we know what the Doughnut is, more or less. This is Kate Rayworth standing in front of a Doughnut graphic. The brilliance of the Doughnut graphic, as Bill has been explaining, is that it brings our ecological ceiling and social foundation together into one visual. So you can really see how everything is interconnected. Some people are quite critical of the Doughnut. They say it fragments everything into sectors and what are called domains. So these wedges are called domains or silos. But we say, actually, if you put everything together into one graphic, it really does something to your brain. Your brain starts to think differently and to understand that ecology and economy are completely interconnected. We started to make the Doughnut for Devon almost exactly 2 years ago. We were inspired to do that. I was going to say impelled to do that, which is also partly true, because there was an online meeting called Regenerate Devon in July of that year, 2020, in which Kate Rayworth sent us a video specifically addressing people in Devon. And my colleague Jane in the Bioregional Learning Centre and I had never seen a chat go on fire in the way that it went on fire, with everyone saying, we've got to make a Doughnut for Devon. And we'd known for some time, for the previous 2 years really, and had been exploring how we might create a baseline for our bioregion of South Devon. And we'd looked at the Doughnut. Our only example at that point that we could find was Scotland, who had created a Doughnut. And we'd also looked at other indices as well, including the Happy City Index and one other, which I don't recall right now. And we'd kind of parked it. We thought, we're not sure we want to go down that route. We're not sure we want to get into data. It's not really our expertise. But we decided to go ahead and to invite everyone who'd come to that Regenerate Devon Summit into a process. And this process was online because of COVID, partly, but we have a very big county in Devon. And we convened on Zoom every 2 weeks for a year. And together as a collective, we created this donut. And why is the Devon donut special or different? It's partly special because we contextualized the names of the domains. So instead of saying things like ocean acidification, we knew that people in Devon would not have a gut response to ocean acidification because you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, you can't really see what it's doing. So we called it coastal marine health. And the collective also renamed some of the other segments or domains of the donut. And from the very beginning, we were quite adamant that this was going to be a people's donut, and it was going to be relevant for people in Devon, and that people in Devon were going to have a hand in deciding what these indicators and thresholds were going to be. So these are our domains, slightly different to Kate Rayworth's original donut. And we also have cross-cutting themes. Tourism is still a theme that we're working into. So at Bioregional Learning Centre, we may be slightly different to other bioregions. We don't have any projects that we own like regenerative farming. Instead, we are creating connective tissue between many different organizations and sectors and projects in Devon, and that connecting up function, which is also a bridging function, means that we're often invisible in what we're doing, but we recognize that that's a very important function if our bioregion is going to be able to function as a bioregion. So these cross-cutting themes are important for that reason. So things like tourism, water, agriculture, they actually go everywhere. They cut across almost every aspect of the donut. And by doing projects that are working into these cross-cutting themes, we're picking up on a lot of the donut domains. So as I said, we contextualized the names of the domains. We also contextualized the indicators. And we contextualized them through running sessions in our coffee and donut Zooms, which brought 4 or 5 experts in that particular domain, whether it was education or health and well-being or coastal marine health, into our conversation. And we asked them to present one scenario in that domain that if we could shift the needle on that particular scenario, would also shift the needle on that domain towards being more healthy, more regenerative. And just to give you a little example, so on the left, we have the number of fishing vessels out of Devon's harbours bottom trawling days per year, and that's under coastal marine health, because shortly before we got to tackle that particular domain, we had read a paper that had been published in Nature, which said that bottom trawling was releasing as much carbon dioxide per year as global aviation. So we thought, right, if we can stop bottom trawling going out of our local harbour, Brixham, which is the biggest fishing harbour in England, we might be able to shift the needle on that domain. But the Brixham harbour master, who came to our coffee and donut sessions, put us straight. He said, you can't name and shame fishing vessels. That's going to be so counterproductive. It's much more intelligent to think of upping the number of highly protected marine areas around the Devon coast, knowing that there's a marine protected area around the island of Lundy, and because it's properly patrolled and vessels are kept out of it, the seabed is regenerating and the sea life is regenerating in a really encouraging way. So all of these propositions that we put forward for indicators were discussed, and there was a whole debate that went on in our collective as to which one to end up with, which one to choose for each domain. So we knew we needed indicator-based actions. We needed to be able to prove both that there was a need to take action, but also that taking action made a difference. So as you can see, this is a circular process here. If you take action in one domain, it has an impact on other domains. So we have a cascade effect. Hopefully, if we're intelligent about the kind of actions we take, we can shift the needle on multiple indices in different domains. We were also quite unique at that time when we were creating the Devon Doughnut among donut makers around the world in coming up with this idea for, on the one hand, citizen-led innovation, and on the other hand, policy change. All the work that we do at Bioregional Learning Centre in our bioregion puts civil society, citizens at the forefront, knowing that if they're not included in all these discussions and actions and planning and so on, we're not going to be able to make the difference that we want to make. It's absolutely crucial that citizens are as engaged as governance, as big business, as policymakers. And so we came up with these two twin tracks. And so for each domain, and you've got an example of education here, we came up with two different linked indicators. So you can probably read this, but I'll read out. So for citizens in education, we came up with an indicator which was the percentage of pupils and parents who advocate for more guided interaction in nature in order to improve student mental health. And in the policymaker side, we have the proportion or percentage of young people of school age prescribed by the National Health Service with time in nature at low, no cost. So you can see they're linked, but they're two separate and different actions. And we see the role of the Bioregional Learning Centre is to make sure those actions are linked and that they talk to each other. So these were the steps in our thinking process, our twin thresholds. We showed you this, I showed you the slide on that. The piece that we haven't actually got to is bottoming out what the thresholds would be for each indicator. And that's our next piece of work that we want to do. Interestingly, when we had a light-hearted poll during one of our Zoom coffee and donut sessions, and we asked them what they thought the donut could be used for, what came out on top was narratives and storytelling, i.e. being able to tell stories of what was actually making a difference to inspire other people, and what people called lighting fires all over Devon. So really kind of saying to Devon, look, we can do this, let's just get up and really make a difference here. No one voted for data comparison or a targeting tool, but we know it's important nonetheless. We also use the donut as a lens for critical thinking. As you can see, there aren't actually any, there's no data, there's no numbers, there's no thresholds here, but using this lens together with Devon County Council, which is our overall governance body for our council. I'm sorry, go back one. We move this just so you can all see that. I move it over here. So what we did is have a conversation in Coffee and Donuts with Devon County Council. They told us about their initiative, which was to bring in charging points for electric vehicles. So we ran electric vehicle charging points through the donut. And as you can see, the only real pluses are in air quality and in health and well-being. We either had an amber for basically we maintain the status quo on greenhouse gas emissions and access to nature. And we definitely go into minus when you think about water body health or biodiversity or equity and equality and community. So what we were pushing for was less tires on the roads giving off microplastics and more public transport or publicly shared transport, including eco cars and things like that. Let me just move this again. So that kind of brings me to the end of our presentation. Interestingly, Devon County Council has reached out to us. They now have a zero carbon plan for Devon. They're not sure how to run the governance on that. They know that it doesn't make sense for it to sit with Devon County Council, and we are going to be in a conversation with them. And we very much want to bring in all this work around thresholds and indicators and carrying capacity So we start to link what's happening in Devon with other places around the world, but also to come up with a robust governance structure that also citizens can be a part of. So thank you. I'm going to hand you back to Bill now.
And I'll hand it right over to Randy, the third and last presentation, and opening things up to conversation after that. So Randy, over to you to give us your experience with municipality level examples.
Thanks very much, Bill. It's great to be with everyone today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit of our story and to engage in what I hope and trust will be a great discussion. I think my talk comes in the perfect place in the presentation, especially with Isabel speaking about how the work of the Devon Doughnut is now kind of emerging into conversation with the local government and their interest in doing things in an integrated and inclusive, transparent manner. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides. I will try to be relatively brief so that we can move on to discussion. And I'll begin with a bit of our theory of change. So my focus is a little bit different. I come with an organizational or an enterprise lens. Also very much deeply interested in perspectives like the Doughnut, as in, recognizing or acknowledging the natural and social thresholds that we need to adhere to in order to pursue the definition of sustainability as it exists, as well as concepts like bioregionalism, which myself and my colleagues also follow very closely and attempt to apply or at least reference in some of the work that we do with organizations. So the narrative is pretty straightforward. We see that most local governments are in need of new capabilities. So if we think about the business model or the operating structure of local government, generally speaking, and based on what we have seen predominantly in the West, most local government organizations are designed to optimize the delivery of services. So they have some sort of jurisdictional boundary. They're legally mandated to deliver on any number of services. And as an organization, their interest, their requirement is to deliver good services. And so their machinery, their operating structure is designed to optimize that delivery of services. And I think what we can say is, as we look at kind of the bigger view, sorry about that, as we see, the overshoot of thresholds and the lack of meeting social foundations, more and more complex issues emerge in the world. We see accelerating change, and local government is daunted because there are issues confronting them that haven't been present in the past, seemingly the same resources and a heck of a lot more to try and manage. And I think most leaders would say they're quite daunted with the challenge at hand. And so I think governments, in response to this increasing challenge and change, have evolved. There's been a natural progression in the purpose of local government. And I would say, while perhaps it's not articulated, maybe in some cases it is, we see local government kind of evolving towards ideas of enabling resilience and empowering communities to pursue their well-being. And the challenge we see is that there is a significant gap between what is the capability and the business model of local government and the new purpose that they're trying to pursue. So the machinery of government is not designed to pursue this new purpose, this higher purpose. And so our view is that we need to transform the guts. We need to transition strategic management practices towards a new paradigm of management that is capable or designed specifically for achieving the sorts of outcomes we're talking about here on the right. So the community of practice that I come from is focused on what I like to, and we like to describe as systemic management innovation. So these would be practical management knowledge methods and tools that are designed based on the application of systems theory, and at a minimum are respectful of planetary boundaries and social foundations, the sciences, in some cases, though, are very much also considerate of those as part of how they're designed. And so within our world, I've broken down this field of management into 3 key focus areas. The first being strategic planning. And across this slide, what I want to do is just very quickly highlight how management functions are traditionally or conventionally applied within most organizations, including municipalities, and then what it might look like differently if a systemic approach were taken, and what possible outcomes come as a result of that change. So from a strategic planning perspective, conventionally, and especially in municipalities, we would see planning being a bounded process that produces something of a static deliverable based on conditions at a point in time. And if we were to take a more systemic approach to strategic planning, we would see a continuous process that generates something that is more dynamic in nature and that can be adapted in response to evolving conditions. And the expected outcome would be that we would have municipalities or local government that are adaptive and more responsive to change and innovative in nature. When we think about performance management as a function, traditionally or conventionally, this would be led separately by each department and focused mainly on financial considerations. And if there were social and environmental considerations, those would be addressed on the side, on the periphery, separate of core practice. From a systemic perspective, though, we would see economic, social, and environmental trade-offs being, one, accurately valued, and that being done in an integrated fashion. And that would lead to municipalities which hold this purpose and many objectives that relate to outcomes across the triple bottom line being both effective and efficient, as in allocating their limited resources optimally across all objectives, all aspects of what they hold as important and valuable in the work that they do. And then the last management function is stakeholder engagement. So conventionally, we see municipalities taking input from different stakeholders more transactionally, and generally it's from a sample of the community that's not really representative of its diversity. When we lead towards a more systemic way of engaging with stakeholders, we see strong relationships being formed with a diversity of stakeholders who are meaningfully engaged in contributing and who are empowered to meaningfully contribute to the outcomes being generated. And this leads to a more resilient municipality and community where stakeholders are empowered and have their needs met. So quickly, the program that I and my colleagues have developed is called Enterprise Evolution. Essentially, we work with leadership teams. We don't really talk much about sustainability per se. We talk about managing for complexity. We talk about the increasing challenges that municipalities face. And in a management-oriented dialogue, we facilitate one, leaders coming to their own self-recognition that conventional practices are actually a much greater risk to them in the current context of accelerating change and increasing complexity than making dramatic change. And that ultimately systemically oriented management innovations are designed specifically to deal with the sorts of scenarios, challenges, issues that they face, and are ultimately going to give them a better opportunity to grapple with what's confronting them. And so around the Enterprise Evolution program, our interest is to continue to test this programmatic intervention with municipalities in Canada, where I live, and abroad. And so we've developed an applied research partnership around this called MARC. That's Municipalities Adapting in Response to Complexity. We've partnered with an organization called ICLEI. So the World Secretariat has a membership of something like 2,700 municipalities globally. They work mainly on climate and sustainability issues, and they've essentially drank the Kool-Aid. They recognize that we're not going to solve climate and sustainability issues in offices and in planning processes that are on the periphery of the organization and separate of core function, and that we need to fundamentally transform municipal government in order to enable the change that we hope to make. And so we've partnered with them, and our goal is really to learn as quickly as possible, which is why you see Veris, which is an applied research partner. We've got academics from various places in the world with across a variety of disciplines who are following this work. And ultimately, our interest is to learn as quickly as possible about how these sorts of innovations apply within a municipal context so that we can continue to adapt and improve and contextualize how they can be applied so that they can be essentially effectively applied by many organizations around the world and quickly. And I guess what I wanted to offer in quickly closing is one, I think the opportunity from a bioregional perspective is to recognize that municipal government is a really critical system actor. When we think about a bioregional approach, municipal governments are already collecting financial resources from many different actors in a system and have significant power, financial resources, and influence that can make dramatic change. And so if they can adapt their own practices, if they can see the value of a systemic lens and a bioregional approach in how they do what they do already, the potential for municipalities to accelerate or catalyze change is tremendous. And so this is why we have focused there. We've been doing some work with two organizations at the moment that I wanted to mention. So one is the City of Kitchener, where we're essentially, we've taken over their 2-year-long strategic planning process and are leading them through the enterprise evolution program as an alternative. And so all of the things that we're doing, from performance management to strategic planning to stakeholder engagement, are being done using systemic management innovations. We've been working with their corporate leadership team, which has led to engagement with leaders across the organization. And now the way the community is being engaged and all else is all kind of enveloped within this enterprise evolution program and being led through systemic approaches. And so far, the results and the engagement, the openness has been great. And we're studying the process and starting to release some of the research artifacts that have been produced. The other example I'll mention very briefly is with a city that chose to adopt the Doughnut not too long ago as part of a large community planning process. Interestingly, as an organization, they attempted to apply the Doughnut, quickly realized that the Doughnut is really just a nice visual in that it represents this concept of a threshold-based world, but doesn't really provide any of the discipline or practical and operational level practice that would need to be employed in order to make sense of the Doughnut at an organizational level. And so they found themselves, like most cities that would try to adopt the Doughnut, struggling to figure out how to make meaning of it in a practical and useful sense at a smaller scale. And so we've used an innovation that was very much behind the work that Bill spoke to earlier in the session, called the multi-capital scorecard, created by, co-developed by one of Bill and Ralph's colleagues, Mark McElroy, who was involved with the UN work. And so the multi-capital scorecard is essentially designed to take what is in essence or in principle behind the Doughnut and apply it at an organizational level. As a tool, it represents a management accounting system, and it essentially applies the same sort of discipline, thought, and rigor that we do to financial performance accounting to all forms of capital, so that they're addressed in one holistic, rigorous, and consistent manner. On that note, I'll pause there and hand it back over to Bill. Thanks so much for listening.
Great, thank you, Randy. Thank you, Isabel. And that opens things up to a conversation amongst all of us. And so I would ask folks to go ahead and raise your hands to ask questions here. There are a few issues that have come up in the sidebar. I think they've largely been answered in the sidebar. You can also ask questions in the chat, and I'll monitor that. I'm serving as both the facilitator here, and I'll take off the facilitator hat when I'm actually answering a question as a content on the content side of things. Mary Lou, I see that you've got a question of which municipality used the scorecard. Randy, I think you had mentioned one of them, and the other one, I think, well, I'll leave it over to you.
Yeah, quickly, the latest project, the one where the Doughnut is perhaps more prominently the focal point, that project just started, and I only had a handful of days to request that we begin talking about this publicly, because they have yet to speak about our collaboration. So I'm not at liberty to release the name, but the other city is the City of Kitchener, as was displayed on the screen.
And I'll just add that the City of Kitchener participated. It was the only municipality to participate in the UNRISD pilot project. And our intention with that was to demonstrate that the indicators could be used at the municipality level to be able to then scale it out with other municipalities. I see a question from Killian. Was that process assessed by regenerative design professionals? Which process do you mean, Killian? The one that Randy was just describing?
That last bit where yeah, where you talked about there's a donut, and so we changed it to this other thing, and yeah, that bit. Actually, all of it. I mean, there's I don't know, there's an awful lot of stuff talked about in regenerative circles that isn't passed through actual physical functioning of the planet, and so that's basically what I'm getting at is are there people who do regenerative work physically involved in that process, or given a chance to give any feedback to you in any of this?
I can answer that for the UNRISD side of things, or the general thinking that's gone on to it. In behind that, Randy and Isabel, then over to you to answer that question for your own instances. In the instance of the UNRISD, it purposefully took an approach of taking a conceptual framework that was developed with regeneration at its core. So that was why I gave this slide. I presented this slide on the notion of resource stocks and flows, that essentially the resources need to be regenerated on a regular basis for our literal survival. And so that is at the core underpinning of the conceptual framework. And then the implementation side of things was piloted with organizations that were mostly companies. So, strictly speaking, I would say a regenerative design professional weren't involved in that particular implementation. But I guess if I'm getting what's underneath the question was the notion of regeneration sort of embedded in the process? Then absolutely, unquestionably, yes. Maybe Randy, over to you, because I think it may have been geared towards you, but then Isabel after that.
And just briefly, Bill, actually your first point was actually accurate. There's a difference between everyone understands there's a limit thing, but not everybody actually understands how to do that, how to create those systems. So I'm actually getting down to the physical aspect of, people in the room who know how to do that versus just understanding the concept.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I'm not sure if it makes sense for Randy and Isabel. If you want to chime in, I think with that clarification, we may have addressed it, but if you want to chime in, go ahead now. And then if not, we'll move on to questions from Paul and Michelle.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in, and I'd love to bring Paul in here too. So in the chat, I've posted the blog post that Paul and I wrote together on how we brought a regenerative donut into being in Devon. Paul and I both are regenerative practitioners and professionals, and we made the donut as regenerative as we could possibly make it. Maybe Paul would like to add something there.
Thanks, Isabel. And I think, Killian, this also morphs into a question. The process, I was honored to be part of the Devon Doughnut process, and we were very conscious that, of slipping into old mechanistic paradigms such that, these individual indicators would define the whole rather than the whole defining the parts, such that the living system was to the forefront rather than, some additive, quantified, entity in the background. So, we were very conscious of holding a whole, and that was framed in part, I think, Isabel, if I'm right in saying, by a story of place for Devon, which is, I guess, still evolving. And yes, that please do, if you're interested, read the article that or the blog post that Isabel and I put together on the process. where it morphs into a question, and I'd be absolutely fascinated, Bill, if I could put this to you, is in relation to my own bioregion. You know, we're currently trying to work out how to finance particular land uses in relation to disadvantaged communities. Now, how do you make decisions about land use? There are some principles that an organization in this country's helpfully put together some principles around how to make choices about what land's best for what, utility, energy, housing, food, and so on. But what we don't know is how do we calculate the allocation of the bioregion such that we can then subdivide that into an allocation to a project, if that makes sense, or a particular land use. That would be hugely helpful.
Great. I think that was geared towards me, Paul, you were saying?
Yes, please.
Great. So I'll answer that one. And then just to, with my facilitator hat on, I'll note that Michelle has a question with her hand up, and then we have at least 3 questions in the sidebar. So we'll get to those next. Paul, you raised the question of allocation here. And so we at R3.0 have been doing, framing our work around the notion of thresholds and allocations. And so generally speaking, you know, you can have a threshold of sort of a limit in the real world, whether that's a minimum amount of regeneration of human knowledge, for example, or a maximum limit of the amount of water you can use or carbon that you can expend. But the question really becomes, how do you parse that out? If we're talking about not a donut, but a pie, how do you slice the pie in the terminology that we use is fair, just, and proportionate ways? So in other words, how do you slice it such that you get a fair slice of the pie? From a technical perspective, there are 3 ways that have been innovated over the past, say, 20 years or so for doing that. Basically, you allocate based on, what's a pie that exists in the real world that you can look at what the actual divisions are. So one is per capita. What's the overall population in a region, and then what is the population of the organization that's having an impact? So a company, for example, or an NGO as an organization. What's their head count and their full-time equivalent calculation for the amount of time that those people are working there? Another way that was innovated was an economic allocation that basically says, well, if you're particularly if this is being applied to companies that are generating financial returns, but also generating both positive and negative impacts, then you could allocate according to that. So you would take GDP, which, with the caveat that everyone knows that GDP sucks as an overall indicator, but it has universal availability of data. So if you're just looking for the pie that needs slicing, that's another way to do it. The third way to do it is on a physical allocation. So if the organization impacts, again, using a commercial example here, if you're a cement producer or a widget producer more generically, how many of all the widgets do you produce? What's your market share, so to speak? There are other ways that one could do allocation. I think where the world would be heading most productively is to find allocation mechanisms that are directly related to the actual impacts themselves. So in that sense, a physical allocation has support in that sense. The economic allocation is largely favored because of the universality of data availability on that front. I guess the last thing I'll say is that, one example that I've heard is in food production. So for looking at the production of food, using nutrient density as your allocation mechanism, because it's literally tied to what it is that you're trying to achieve here. Is we're trying to produce nutrition with food. So without going too deeply into the weeds there, I think that's what those are the approaches that have been applied to date. So just to round that out, on a bioregional basis, the first thing that would happen is that, a bioregion is part of the global population. So you could allocate that way. And then within the bioregion, you have to do a sub-allocation, if you will. And that's where I think engagement with the citizenry is really key. So the work that you and Isabel were doing, directly engaging and having citizens make their own determinations about thresholds and allocations is really key.
Thank you, Bill.
Great, Paul. Michelle, why don't we take your question, and then after that we'll go over to the chat, and I'll pull together some of the questions there or ask people to voice them. So Michelle, you first, and then we'll go over to the sidebar.
Thank you. I was thinking also, just linking up just to the previous one in terms of allocation in South Africa, of course, with the historical apartheid issue, in many senses, it's a reallocation because of the land disputes and the water, who had water rights, like in the river, how the land was divided, and that is perhaps one of the hot potatoes at the moment, is land use planning. So all of our local governments have to do spatial development plans, and all of our spatial development plans are bioregionally based. I mean, that is kind of like across the board. Although we don't incorporate the Doughnut, we definitely have within that spatial plan SDGs, and then the cross-cutting climate, or like we've done like an integrated biodiversity, which will look at terrestrial, freshwater, all the aquatic, marine, coastal, estuary. So they've done that for prioritization. But the two things I wanted in terms of is recognizing that the municipalities are politically, administratively, and fiscally determined. They're not bioregionally. And that's been, when we had the water crisis in South Africa, that was the biggest thing, were all the silos. And so how do you actually bring those, although they're doing planning or doing a donut, is how you integrate that. So that would be that is for me probably one of the biggest challenges. The other one is the finance, because you're looking at, for example, in South Africa, we have a dual economy. You'll have half your population unemployed, and then you'll have the other half in the formal economy. And if you're going to be financing some of this, there's no tax base to be financing. So in terms of capability and capacity to actually finance the transition or to finance, it just doesn't exist. So, I mean, we've done like trying to do multi-criteria decision-making, prioritize where the funding, but it's a blockage. And I think I wanted just to link that to the first presentation, because we're not just looking at the Doughnut and at bioregion, but we're also linking this now with the global commons, particularly if we're looking at climate change. And I think what becomes really important is not just it becomes in terms of equity. And again, at a South African level, we look at history, South Africa's apartheid history, and then in terms of capability and capacity, what sorts of technology, what sorts of finance do we need? And this is, we're not seeing any movement. So for me, even at a local level, or if we start to kind of bring it out into the global commons, whether it's the oceans or that, there's not, so for me, I haven't seen, and I'm still not seeing where that breakthrough is coming through the systems that we're using. So I was wondering, I think that would be the one would be in terms of where are we seeing this? Where do we see this breakthrough coming through to make the transition with our plans, with what we have? And then the other question I have is in terms of innovation, because at a local government level, because they have to do all these performance measurements, the innovation, it's not there. So where are we seeing the innovation? I'm not seeing it at that local spatial government level. So where are we seeing the innovation, or where, maybe Randy, where are you seeing? Because people have to report on their KPIs and everything, and they're too afraid to step out of the norm, and many of them, they've just been trained in the norm. So where is that innovation actually taking place? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And thank you for steering the innovation question to Randy. I'm going to actually steer your first question around the funding, and in particular the funding flows that are outside of, say, formal avenues. I'm going to steer that one to Isabel, as particularly having contributed a chapter to the R3.0 funding governance for systemic transformation, where we addressed a lot of these questions of how to create alternative funding flows. So maybe Isabel, if you could speak to that and the chapter that you wrote, or you may have other angles, and then Randy on the question of innovation.
Okay, thank you, Bill. And maybe Paul wants to step in here too, because we did the work together. But so what we did for Blueprint 8, together with Ralph and Bill, over the summer, was to review all the different ways in which there are projects around the world that are being funded by so-called regenerative funding streams. So there are multiple ways in which organizations, corporations even, are coming up with innovative ideas to fund a lot of this work, which is happening at ground level, at bioregional level or bigger. Many of them are not regenerative, despite calling themselves that. Just to give you an example, there's a part of the Highlands. I can't remember what part of the Highlands it is, Paul, and I keep forgetting the name. It's not, is it Afric? I think it might be the Afric Highlands. It's the Western Highlands of Scotland. And they've got a project underway, which is about rewilding the Highlands. And what they've done is create a very kind of clever mechanism for fossil fuel companies to pay into this project for rewilding. And in return, they get carbon credits, because rewilding is also carbon sequestration. And they create a very all singing, all dancing visitor center. But the reality is that what we're reverting to here is a form of the Highland clearances, because the people who live on the land are encouraged not to farm the land any longer. The old township system of farming, which is like a commons, is being to a certain extent dismantled by that. So what we were impressed by in particular, and can point you to, is an initiative in Canada called the Dashkan EB Conservation Impact Bond, which is a mechanism for, in a sense, local authorities through procurement processes to direct funding to conservation efforts that would improve the environment and would also improve the lives of local people. So local people also are able to pitch for the activities that get funded. This whole mechanism, the whole bond structure, was created over several years together with local indigenous peoples. And they came up with this model, which we think is one of the most intelligent around. It's not one of the only ones around, but there are innovative models out there. I mean, Common Land, for instance, is one of them that's worth looking at. But if you look either at the blueprint or at the blog posts on the Bioregional Learning Center website, you'll find our whole investigation is charted there. But Paul, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you put it very eloquently, Isabel.
Okay,
Thanks,
great.
Randy, over to you to the, actually, this will really be kind of bridging on the question of innovation.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure if my answer appeases what you're looking for, but to be clear about it, me and my colleagues have been innovating management knowledge tools and methods. So if we were to step back and say, what would it look like for an organization to develop a strategic plan if they came at it applying the lens of systems theory and in a manner that would be naturally respectful of planetary boundaries and social foundations? And so many of the colleagues within my community of practice have their own domain of expertise, some aspect of management that they've become quite deeply entrenched in, whether that's management accounting or business modeling or strategic planning. And they've spent the bulk of a decade or longer conceiving on what would it look like for these practices to evolve in a manner that would be, let's say, enabling of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And so when you say, where's the innovation happening? At baseline, the innovation is happening in completely disrupting and transforming how we understand the practice of management at baseline. So we've designed a program that says leaders need a new set of capabilities. They need a new way of understanding the organization within its context and systemically. And then they need new tools, methods, and practices that redefine how they do what they do and the ways they've understood those in order to enable the possibility of a regenerative future. And so there are many different innovations that have been developed over time in this sort of line of thinking that would be useful within a program like that. And our interest is to engage leaders in an organization in a conversation about beginning that transition by appealing to their own discomfort with the challenges that they're not able to effectively engage in anymore using conventional practices, and in pursuing what they're most motivated to pursue. And sometimes that has to do with what's on the table. You know, maybe there's an upcoming strategic planning process. Perhaps they're struggling with a community issue and they want to deal with a challenge related to reconciliation of past issues. It really depends. And so our interest is to lead transition. It is a long transition. The transformation management practices is not something that happens overnight or in one fell swoop. And so then the innovation looks like where they go to work. They would apply a systemically designed innovation to the development of their strategic plan or to the engagement of a stakeholder group in a process of repairing a relationship that would be different than what they would typically try to do. And the innovation would come out of applying those innovations in practice. So I don't know if that helps. I get that that's a bit of a generic response, but there isn't a simple answer. And if you want to know more about what do those innovations look like or how do they work, unfortunately, all of them are extremely complex and would take more than me giving you a minute explanation or a 2-minute long explanation about how we do strategic planning differently or performance management differently, et cetera.
Okay. Great, thank you, Randy. And just thank you also for that acknowledgement that, you know, some of these answers may not comprehensively address the questions that are coming up. So we're doing our best. Given the time, I'm going to just bundle several of the questions that they're coming up in the sidebar, and I'm going to just voice them for efficiency here. And then have the several questions out there for responses. One of them is from Mary Lou to Isabel, just sharing about the role of citizens observers, so the citizen science element that you mentioned. The next one is from Paula, and she was curious to know about how the Doughnut evaluates the impact on the bioregions territory as compared to the impact that a bioregion has on other bioregions limits. And so I think I can speak to that one. Jennifer had oriented one specifically to Randy and Isabel about the question of motivation. What has been your experience of being able to activate and motivate people at the municipal and bioregional levels towards learning and action, et cetera? What do aspects of engagement energize participants to collaborate? Jennifer also had a question about if allocations are directly related to impacts, how does that take into account reparations or sociocultural dynamics and historical awareness, as well as the wellness of future generations? That one, Randy, you just at least touched on briefly. So we'll see if we have time to come back to that one. But the last one I want to mention is from Melina. She says, is there an effort of connecting communities and municipalities Have you found resistances or tensions as a kind of pattern, particularly for the global north, and how have you worked with that? So those are the questions. We'll address as many of these as possible in the next 11 minutes or so. So Isabel, over to you to just discuss the role of citizen observers or citizen scientists.
So in Europe, and I'm not sure if this is also current in other parts of the world, there's the concept of the citizen observatory, which is very much about collecting information about your local place and sharing it. So when my colleagues and I set up the Bioregional Learning Center organization nearly 6 years ago now, we knew that we needed what we call still a backroom for the bioregion. We knew that we needed the capacity to be able to collect and crunch data and share data, and that this data would not just be cool data, it would not just be quantitative or hard data. We also needed to be able to collect and share warm data, qualitative data, i.e. kind of narrative, stories, lived experience. And we're still working on how we bring that into being. But we did do a project very recently on our river called Voices of the Dart, which asked the question, if water could speak, what would it say? But it also included water as how you measure water. And we've teamed up with a local citizen science project to do with measuring water. But I also want to kind of, it also morphs into this question of motivation to learning and action, which Jennifer asked. We tend not to have a kind of game plan in mind of achieving everything. We go where the energy is. And we know there's a lot of energy around water at the moment. People are really concerned about the river, not just in terms of water quantity, i.e. getting very low in the summer, but also water quality. And I'm sure many of you know that the rivers in the UK are in a really bad state because way too much sewage is being released into them. And so we, knowing where that there's energy around that, we work into where we see it's possible to collaborate with other people. And it kind of relates to Melina's question too, about the resistance in connecting up municipalities and communities, or governance maybe in civil society might be another way of talking about this. So in the way in Bioregional Learning Centre in South Devon, that we prioritize civil society means that we create the spaces where civil society and governance, municipalities or county councils or whoever, can come together and have conversations about the things that matter to them and see them as a whole system. So see the watershed as a whole system, or see the capacity of the water company to deliver water to customers and the responsibility of people on the ground, communities, individuals to act as stewards of the water is something that it is possible to reconcile. And how do we do that? And yes, there's been some resistance, but the resistance mainly comes because they've never talked to each other before. They've never looked each other in the eyes before. So we think it's a core bioregional function, is creating spaces where people can look each other in the eye and have good conversations.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel. And actually, I think that might be a good bridge. As facilitator and contributor, I'll defer over to Randy first, and then maybe come back if there's time to me answering Paula's question. But Randy, if you might want to take Melina's question, I think looks like it was directed to the municipality level around resistances and tensions. And then also Jennifer's question about the motivation, which are in some ways two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I mean, ultimately, working with municipal leadership is very much a change conversation, and the tensions are there no matter what. But I think what we have discovered and what we're very encouraged by is the dialogue that we're leading, which is not about an ethical, moral obligation. It's not about sustainability. It's not about having to do something. It's about speaking to them about the challenge of the work that they're doing, about the inefficacy or inadequacy of the practices, the tools, the methods that they are used to employing and that they have successfully employed for likely the duration of their career, and then giving them the space to talk about their own trepidation, their sense of anxiety, their feeling that the walls are caving in to some degree. And I don't think there's many leaders in the world who don't feel like that, regardless of their sector, field, or space right now. It's allowed for them to be vulnerable and open and to speak to what they're experiencing. And in the space that gets created as that opens up, being able to speak to the relevance of a systemically oriented approach to management, one that is capable of engaging with the complexity by design and not based on the intelligence of the individual who happens to be trying to think of all the things that matter in a manner that the tool or practice that they're using doesn't, is really appealing. And so it seems like we've been able to create spaces where leaders are suddenly open to the possibility of doing things dramatically differently. And so we're still very much burgeoning in the space. This is new. And so we haven't worked with a dozen municipalities to transform their organization over 5 years. You know, we're working with our first few, and our experience is that leaders are getting quite motivated. They're open to conversations about doing things dramatically differently. They're open to points of view that mean they have to relinquish power, that require them to be vulnerable and open to what they might be exposed to needing to do differently, or even how wrongly they have been doing things in the interest of a better future. And they seem motivated to learn and adapt practice. And so there's no guarantee that the innovations, even though they're systemically designed, will change the world in all the ways that we hope. But coming from the sustainability space and understanding the futility of trying to make change in climate and sustainability and equity, diversity, inclusion offices and planning processes, this seems like we're opening up a very disruptive and different possibility for making change, and that there's the potential, especially within the municipal space, for this to scale. One of the really amazing things from my perspective about the municipal space is that aside from municipalities being fantastic leverage points, they win by being copied, not by developing a competitive advantage. So when a municipality does something well, they have platforms and networks through which they can very quickly share what they've done all over the world. And their interest is for others to know how they did that. So there's the potential for lots of scale and for innovation to be disseminated very quickly, which is encouraging as well.
Yeah, that's a huge point, Randy, because that competitive advantage often leads to non-scaling, and this does the opposite. I'll chime in at the end here. We've got 3 minutes left, and I'll respond to both Paula's question about impacts inward and outward, and tie that into Jennifer's question about historical and future accountability. So really this approach to called context-based sustainability is predicated on the idea of both outside in impacts and inside out impacts. So in the corporate realm right now, this is known as single materiality, or something as a material issue if the outside world impacts the organization. That's what traditional financial materiality or financial assessment looks at. And it's pretty broadly agreed that that's insufficient to just look at how the world impacts me. I've characterized this in public comment letters to organizations globally as a sociopathic or narcissistic approach. You also, in order to be non-narcissistic or non-sociopathic, in other words, to be an empathic human being or human system, you would have to look also at how do I impact the world. So this is known as double materiality in the lingua franca. I have recently asserted the idea of triple materiality, which also looks at the threshold. So it's not just, am I impacting others, but am I impacting them in a way that actually puts their well-being and their sustainability, their survivability at risk? So to your question, Paula, I do think that essentially assessing not just sort of what are the impacts on a bioregion, but how does a bioregion affect other bioregions is key. And that ties into Jennifer's question, where if we look at this historically, or even in a future-oriented perspective, certain bioregions, for example, in the global north, have been adversely impacting other bioregions for centuries, if not more. And so that looking not just at a current snapshot, but also as the bioregion that I live in traditional Mohican lands, and the Mohicans, their vision statement is to assess everything through 12 generations, not 7 generations, 12 generations, and not just in the future, but also in the past. We often think about, 7 generations means thinking down the line. It also means taking accountability for past harm. So we're at the hour, and that doesn't at all do justice to these great questions. But I hope that Isabel and Randy and I have answered things sufficiently to at least get some conversation happening across this bioregional regeneration summit. So thank you, everyone. I want to respect time by ending on time. I can certainly hang out for a little while longer if there are additional questions, but if people do need to get off on the hour, I did want to have an official close of our session now. So thanks everyone for attending.